The Obama administration poised to appeal a move by a federal judge in Texas that has temporarily blocked the president's executive actions when it comes to immigration. Well, today, the Department of Homeland Security was to begin accepting applications for work permits and legal protections from hundreds of thousands of undocumented workers. This all comes as funding for the Department of Homeland Security is set to expire at the end of the month. The president's plan, it would give up to 5 million immigrants who are in the United States illegally the right to stay and obtain work permits, along with a whole host of conditions. Now, the measure would also continue to strengthen border security, streamline legal immigration, focus on earned citizenship, and crack down on employers who are hiring people who are, in fact, undocumented. Now, the federal judge's move, has temporarily halted this process. The judge says the White House overstepped its authority. Legal fight, it could take months, and it may even head all the way to the Supreme Court. President Obama, for his take, says the move, it is a blow to those who are just trying to support their families.
We should not be tearing some mom away from her child when the child has been born here and that mom's been living here for the last 10 years, minding her own business and being a important part of the community. We should be focusing on stopping people at the borders, reinforcing our effectiveness there, going after criminals and felons who are in our midst, who we can deport.
You know, Mark, from the legal quote-unquote experts I've heard here, most believe that this judge's decision in Texas will be overturned. It is in the authority to use an executive order on this. Do you agree?
I really don't know, but you have to distinguish the politics of this, and I agree with everything the president said politically, from the legal challenge. The ruling, although it was 123 pages long, is a very narrow ruling, aside from all the editorializing the judge does in the opinion. And the crux of the opinion is that the government simply, the administration simply did this without affording the public the right to notice and comment on it, and that's a requirement of the Administrative Procedures Act. So
but what I didn't get, I read that, Mark, but what I didn't get was, then isn't by definition every executive order basically, you know, fly in the face of what the congressional role ought to be, that there's a middle branch in our government and that they have to approve everything?
Well, that depends on whether it's a valid executive order or whether it amounts to rulemaking or worse, legislation. And, you know, really, there's an irony to this because George W. Bush was the king of executive orders, and now Obama is just doing the same thing, so turnabout is fair play.
President Bush, I'm talking the last President Bush, his immigration plan was even more open-ended than this particular one, and we know that didn't become law. I'm trying to separate the politics of this from the law. It does seem interesting to me, Doug, that where does the line start from what the president can do, and where does the line start from in terms of where Congress, and we're even seeing this as it relates to the War Powers Act and what the president didn't have to go for Congress for approval, and if people want to know on the political side, Congress would rather not go to them for approval on this, so they didn't have to make a decision. But where does the line start and stop from what the executive branch can do by themselves versus where they have to go to the legislative branch to get an okay?
I think nobody really knows. And I think that's what this judge is kind of taking the opening shot, saying, listen, I think it's unconstitutional. Now it's going to go back, and they're going to have other courts scrutinize it. And when those courts start to scrutinize it, they're going to start putting in place a framework of what he can and can't do, because they realize he's got 2 years left and that he's going to be fighting and not getting a lot done. And there's going to be a lot of this potentially going on.
You know, well, the Constitution says that it's for Congress to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. The question is, putting the labels aside, what is this executive action?
Right.
Is it policy making or enforcement on the one hand, which the president is allowed to do, or does it amount to de facto legislation, which is the province of Congress? That's the question.
It's a multifaceted executive order, and I think that that's where the line is. Part of it has to do with what is akin to prosecutorial discretion, because part of it is saying to stop certain deportations. People can be deportable, but I think the executive order, or it is within his power to say, just like Holder came out and said, do not prosecute for the toughest crime under federal law. It's within his power to say, don't deport certain people, don't enforce it against certain people. But I think the problem is when you start granting work permits and other means with which people attain their legal status, then
but not
you're
yet
legislating.
citizenship.
But
And
still
we're
you-
not getting into the line of who is an American citizen, who isn't. This is coming down to visas, in effect, here, and work permits. I'm not trying to oversimplify it, I guess I am. But my point is, isn't it a distinction with a difference?
But work permits and social security numbers and cards, which are part of this executive order, they bestow upon the person certain rights upon which
Yeah.
they can build towards naturalization.
you know,
There's
Mayo,
a Supreme
for-
Court case pending now in December. This is about the passport case, right?
Yeah.
Who has the authority to recognize Jerusalem? That decision from the Supreme Court may help clarify the respective relation of
isn't-
Congress and the president in this
Isn't
area.
in a certain way, Mayo, this has always gone on, but it seems that maybe there's more of an intensity lately. If you think about, what did we talk about last week? We talked about in Alabama, right? Where a state says, I don't care what you say. I'm not going to recognize in my state who can and can't get married, in effect here. You had the fight last week in Congress, basically, or where the president can or can't go. There's a political aspect, obviously, in terms of use of force. Right. Now we're having who can and can't decide who can become an American citizen. There's always been, states' rights, and even more micro than states' rights here. It seems that it's getting more and more pronounced, that everybody wants to be their own entity, maybe even more than they wanted to be before. And in Texas, they're going to feel one way about this, and in New York, they'd feel a different way. Nothing new. This is not breaking new ground. But it seems the fights we're having have a common thread to it, much more so in terms of regularity than we're used to.
It's much more political than anything else. And if you go back and you look at Ronald Reagan's position on immigration, I mean, he pushed it actually beyond what Obama's suggesting right now.
Yep.
But when you're in favor of Ronald Reagan, you don't have a problem with that. George Bush, again, same thing. He was very much, a million executive orders. Nobody complained about them if you
But the
voted for.
Republican
If you
Party
voted.
turned on him when it came to immigration. You didn't get Republican Party
That's
support
true,
when it
but,
came
but
to
again,
that.
it depends on who's in. Is your person in the White
Yeah.
House? If they are, then generally you're all right with it. But we keep moving those lines. You look at the War Powers Act, we really don't pay attention to any of the constitutional restraints. And you stop also and you look, is it popular? If it's popular, it really kind of doesn't matter what you're doing.
I've got a case right after this in terms of popular and unpopular, but also the law and kind of making up as we go along here. We're going to head out to Nassau County, and that's where a law that was imposed tough residency restrictions on registered sex offenders. Well, that's been thrown out by a judge. We're going to have much more from our legal panel on where the law starts and stops when it relates to sex offenders when they get out.